Hi there. In this lecture we see Moritz Porges against Emanuel Lasker in the 1896 Nuremberg tournament round 1. e4 from Porges, we have e5 from Lasker, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now the Berlin defense. And we see a very interesting variation of the Berlin. So white castles, knight takes e4, d4, and now bishop e7. So this is the kind of old main line. The new main line, which in many ways is more boring actually than this old main line, is knight d6, inviting an exchange of queens, and we've seen this in many World Championship games. The thing is, this is kind of dull for spectators in those World Championship matches, and it usually just ends in draws. Black has the bishop pair, and you know, the double pawns aren't such a big deal. They're not really that exploitable, so black's thought to be about equal. But this old line has the merit that it is more exciting. It keeps the queens on, and there's a peculiar aspect of it. We see queen e2. If d takes e5, black is fine with d5. For example, here e takes, knight takes d6. White's only got a small edge here. So queen e2 is played, and we see knight d6, bishop takes c6, and now b takes c6. This is actually really important to give the knight a fianchetto square. Now this looks amusing and it looks silly and was kind of mocked even at the time, but you look at the latest Stockfish and this is like, it's only a small edge for white. This is only a temporary kind of inconvenience, a temporary you know, once the knight can get back in the game, it can re-centralize. Or if d5, it's going to re-centralize on knight takes d6 sometimes. But, you know, there's a route, knight c5 to e6 to blockade the pawn, which looks like a, you know, quite a positional route to keep the shield pawn, you know, on the e-file. This isn't entirely a bad line. It seems to have engine approval. So is Lasker ahead of his time, or is Lasker also ahead of our time? Both, because this keeps complexity in the position and seems a lot of fun to fianchetto a knight. If instead, by the way, there's, yeah, I mean it's just a lot of fun here. So if black had played d takes c6, this is a big problem, because d takes e5. As an example, knight f5, white has rook d1, and this pin is actually rather painful indeed. White has a forcing move coming up, knight c3, say black castles. Can you see what white plays here? This is why this is unplayable. You have to like fianchetto the knight. g4, it's unplayable for black. If knight h4, knight takes, bishop takes, g5, and the queen is kind of overloaded here. If bishop takes, rook takes d7, bang, bishop takes, white's winning. So this is why, you know, the fianchetto of the knight isn't so silly. It's not silly at all, it seems. d takes, knight b7. We see b3. Knight c3 might be slightly better, and yeah, white's advantage is only, it's only small here. But b3 is played, which creates, you know, some downsides, some weak dark squares. Bishop b2, d5, and now e takes. Okay, in theory, you know, it opens up the bishop. It shouldn't be that bad. But, you know, c4 should be considered as well. For example, this position should be about even. So e takes there was played, c takes, which undoubles the pawns. Knight bd2 and rook e8. So black's position isn't that bad at all. Black does have a bishop without a counterpart. The knight is only temporarily inconvenienced. To get the bishop pair like this for an inconvenienced knight, which can easily re-centralize, it isn't a big deal. Rook fe1, bishop d7. And now white slips up with knight e4, and the game takes a really dramatic turn here with this X-ray, latent X-ray. It seems after this move, white is pushed into a reactive mode, having to react to threats. And let's qualify that reactive mode. If you can actually parry each and every threat without incurring a disadvantage, then maybe that's not a big deal. Or even get advantages through parrying threats. Then you don't mind at all being in reactive mode. The reactive mode version where you're compromising your position reacting to threats is worse, and we get that here. Instead of knight e4, knight f1 was safer, as an example. And old annotators of the game have alluded to queen f1, but knight f1 looks more sensible if it's actually possible to play knight f1. Which I believe it is. If bishop f6, we could take on f6, we're hitting the queen. So this is possible, and d5, queen d2. You know, this is possible, and it should be an even position. So anyway, knight e4 is played, which makes the game really quite amusing. First threat, d5, hitting the knight. Every move becomes like a threat. So this whole reactive mode, it's interesting to theoretically discuss that. Does it actually create downsides when you parry threats? Knight ed2, not much of a downside there, or is it? There is. If knight g3, this is worse, because bishop b4 hits the rook, hits the queen, and this wins basically the exchange. If knight c3, even worse, bishop a3 hits the unprotected piece on b2, so that loses. So basically, knight ed2 is needed, and we see now bishop a3, and white has only one move to try and not lose a piece, basically. So this is extremely awkward to handle this threat of winning the piece. We see here, well, there's one or two moves. Bishop e5 is played. If queen a6, black can play bishop takes b2, and here there's knight c5. So white will be losing material. You know, this is a loss of material. The queen hasn't got a5. It's a loss of material. Thanks very much. So bishop e5, f6, and this pawn has got a career to it. It's going to become a spearhead pawn, the way this is played. Queen a6. So white is reacting, having to react like this, and is creating a massive downsides in the process now. So even though white hasn't lost the piece, Lasker takes on e5, and he's delighted now to play this e4. What an aggressive pawn structure. Very aggressive. Knight d4, queen f6. So threat queen takes d4. c3 weakens d3. Look at the downsides of parrying the threats in particular. And I am interested in this subject because I've noticed Kasparov has called it hard pressing. But as I say, I think if we qualify our hard pressing, we can use this concept even more, you know, effectively. We want to be able to create threats which create downsides at each and every threat that we make. So there's a d3 downside, and that is actually the basis. That weakness becomes that, you know, this creates a threat on f2, and this creates dark square weaknesses now. And here, this threat is very inconvenient. It pacifies the queen, okay, but it also sets up potential issues with bishop h3 at some point as well, in some variations. If the knight had gone to f1, then e takes f3 simply is quite crushing. And if knight takes, rook takes. So queen c1, and now knight c5. The threat is knight d3, using that light square weakness from the previous threat. If the opponent is moving pawns in response to threats, that's even better. Pawns are irreversible decisions of the chessboard. Irreversible damage, irreversible downsides. So we see knight f1. Okay, the queen gets out of the way, queen g6. So renewing knight d3 as a threat. We see And also, you know, e takes as a threat, you know, because if knight takes, rook takes. So we see rook e3 trying to address both of those. Knight d3, queen d1. But now knight f4 with the threat of queen takes g2, mate. Knight g3. And now h5 with the threat of h4. Yeah, it's horrible. Knight d e2. And now, in this position, as a reward for parrying all the threats, in such a manner, in creating downsides, both on the light squares and dark squares, there's a beautiful finishing combination here. Can you spot it for 500 points? Black to play. Okay. Knight takes g2. It's crushing. King takes g2. E takes f3. Check. This has got a really major point now. Rook takes f3. If king h1, h4 is strong. For example, this position is just crushing. The pressure on f3 is enormous. That enormous pin, that is going to lose white material. Bang. White's going to lose material. So rook takes f3 here. Bishop h3 check. This is the crushing bolt from blue here. Bishop h3 check. King takes. If king h1, we just take on f3. And then here, for example, rook d3 with tempo. So king takes. Queen g4 check. Queen takes f3 check. h4. Now, after knight h1, queen e3 check, white resigns. If king g2, h3 is checkmate. If knight f2, queen takes f2 check, h3, this is going to be, it's devastation. Yeah, it's absolute devastation. And one's just getting mated. So yes, a beautiful game, and it really brings this whole subject about if you get the opponent to be reactive, how do we qualify that? What do we want to aim when we want the opponent to react to threats? We want to create downsides at each and every threat we make, irreversible downsides ideally, and you know, leading to a winning checkmate combination ideally. So we end the battle, we end the war, not just the battle, we end the whole war with the finishing, you know, combination. So it has everything. It has a vivid, truly vivid demonstration of putting the opponent in a totally reactive mode, in one which in each reaction to the threats there's downsides being created which sow the seeds for the destructive final mating combination. So a really beautiful, instructive game indeed. And it was also featured in one of my favourite books ever, you know, for me, one of my favourite books by Chernev, The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played, also features this book. You know, with every move as a threat theme. But it's interesting to think scientifically about that. How do we make that theme even more effective? Our threats, if the opponent parries them and compromises their position further, that's the ideal, that's the dream, in my view, as we see in this game, as a vivid example of that. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it as much as me. Thanks so much.